Page 86. At the time of writing this book, COVID-19 has already unleashed a global wave of social unrest. It started in the US with the Black Lives Matter protests, following the killing of George Floyd at the end of May 2020, but it rapidly spread around the world. COVID-19 was a determining element. George Floyd's death was the spark that lit the fire of social unrest, but the underlying conditions created by the pandemic, in particular, the race inequalities that it laid bare and the rising level of unemployment, were the fuel that amplified the protests and kept them going. How? Over the past 6 years, nearly 100 African Americans have died in police custody, but it took the killing of George Floyd to trigger a national uprising. Therefore, it is not by chance that this outburst of anger occurred during the pandemic that has disproportionately affected the U.S. African American community. As pointed out earlier, at the end of June 2020, the mortality rate inflicted by COVID-19 on Black Americans was 2.4 times higher than for white Americans. Simultaneously, employment among Black Americans was being decimated by the coronavirus. This should not come as a surprise. The economic and social divide between the African Americans and white Americans is so profound that according to almost every metric, Black workers are disadvantaged compared to white workers. Source number 63. In May 2020, unemployment among African Americans stood at 16.8% versus a national level of 13.3%. A very high level that feeds into a phenomenon described by sociologists as biographical availability. Source number 64. The absence of full-time employment tends to increase the participation level in social movements. We do not know how the Black Lives Matter movement will evolve, and if it persists, what form will it take? However, indications show it is turning into something broader than race-specific issues. The protests against systemic racism have led to more general calls about economic justice and inclusiveness. This is a logical segue to the issues of inequality addressed in the previous subchapter, which also illustrates how risks interact with each other and amplify one another. This is a reading of COVID-19, The Great Reset by Klaus Schwab and Thierry Malloret. I'll pronounce it that way. I hold and own no copyrights for educational purposes only. Encouraged Socratic discussion and methods, whether live on this timeline or forever hold your Reese's Pieces. Thank you for listening to the reading of this wonderful blue book. Page 7. This is a logical segue to the issues of inequality addressed in the previous subchapter, which also illustrates how risks interact with each other and amplify one another. It is important to emphasize that no situation is set in stone and that there are no mechanical triggers for social unrest. In quotes, mechanical. In quotes, mechanical. It is important to emphasize that no situation is set in stone and that there is no mechanical triggers for social unrest. You just outlined it above. It remains an expression of a collective human dynamic and frame of the mind that is dependent upon a multitude of factors. others. True to the notions of interconnectedness and complexity, outbursts of social unrest are quintessential, nonlinear events that can be triggered by a broad range of political, economic, societal, technological, and environmental factors. They range from things as different as economic shocks, hardship caused by extreme weather events, racial tensions, food scarcity, and even sentiments of unfairness. And to a lesser extent, companies and other organizations can prepare to mitigate the risk by enacting the right policies. The greatest underlying cause of social unrest is inequality. The policy tools to fight unacceptable levels of inequality do exist. The policy tools to fight unacceptable levels of inequality do exist, and they often lie in the hands of governments. 1.3.3. The return of big government, in the words of John Micklethwaite and Adrian Wooldridge. The COVID-19 pandemic has made government important again, not just powerful again. Look at those once mighty companies begging for help, but also vital again. It matters enormously whether your country has a good health service, competent bureaucrats, and sound finances. Good government is the difference between living and dying. Source number 65. One of the great lessons of the past 5 centuries in Europe and America is this acute crises contribute to boosting the power of the state. It's always been the case, and there is no reason why it should be different with the COVID-19 pandemic. Historians point to the fact that the rising fiscal resources of capitalist countries from the 18th century onwards were always closely associated with the need to fight wars, particularly those that took place in distant countries. And that required maritime capacities. Such was the case with the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763. Described as the first truly global war that involved all the great powers of Europe at the time, since then, the responses to major crises have always further consolidated the power of the state. Starting with taxation, an inherent and essential attribute of sovereignty belonging as a matter of right to every independent government. Source number 66. A few examples illustrating the point strongly suggest that this time, as in the past, taxation will increase. As in the past, the social rationale and political justification underlying the increases will be based upon the narrative of countries at war, only this time against an invisible enemy. I do have to thank you for putting it all into one book, so I didn't have to pay attention for 37 years to the bull crap. Though, whether you were or weren't, you knew something about it. And I know that, and I can prove that. I can circle back. I have all the time. All the time! COVID-19, the Great Reset. Klaus Schwab and Theory Way from Publishing. This is your hawk. I can't put up a digital hawk. Very difficult to say. At high velocity. I hold no copyrights and not monetized. This is for Socratic debate, live chat comments. Forever now, Ultras of Jesus. Over page 90, somewhere. Poison sticks. Da, 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 da.
Starting with taxation in a few examples illustrating the point strongly suggest that this time, as in the past, taxation will increase as in the past. Social rationale and political justification underlying the increases will be based upon the narrative of countries at war, only this time against an invisible enemy. France's top rate of income tax was zero in 1914. A year after the end of World War I, it was 50%. Canada introduced income tax in 1917 as a temporary measure to finance the war, and then expanded it dramatically during World War II, with a flat 20% surtax imposed on all income tax payable by persons other than corporations, and the introduction of high marginal tax rates, 69%. Rates came down after the war, but remained substantially higher than they had been before. Similarly, during World War II, income tax in America turned from a, quote, class tax, unquote, to a, quote, mass tax, unquote, with the number of payers rising from 7 million in 1940 to 42 million in 1945. The most progressive tax years in U.S. history were 1944 and 1945, with a 94% rate applied to any income above $200,000. The equivalent in 2009 of $2.4 million. Such top rates, often denounced as confiscatory by those who had to pay them, would not drop below 80% for another 20 years. At the end of World War II, many other countries adopted similar and often extreme tax measures in the UK during the war. The top income tax rate rose to an extraordinarily stunning 99.25%! Exclamation point, source number 67. Top of page 91. At times, the sovereign power of the state to tax translated into tangible societal gains in different domains, such as the creation of a welfare system. However, these massive transitions to something entirely new, in quotes, were always defined in terms of a response to a violent external shock, to the threat of what to come. World War II, for example, led to the introduction of cradle-to-grave state welfare systems in most of Europe. So did the Cold War governments in capitalist countries were so worried by an internal communist rebellion that they put into place a state-led model to forestall it. This system, in which state bureaucrats managed large chunks of the economy ranging from transportation to energy, stayed in place well into the 1970s. Today, the situation is fundamentally different in the intervening decades. In the Western world, the role of the state has shrunk considerably. This is a situation that is set to change because it is hard to imagine how an exogenous shock of such magnitude as the one inflicted by COVID-19 could be addressed with purely market-based solutions. Already and almost overnight, the coronavirus succeeded in altering perceptions about the complex and delicate balance between the private and public realms in favor of the latter. It has revealed that social insurance is efficient and that offloading an ever greater deal of responsibilities like health and education to individuals and the markets may not be in the best interest of society. In a surprising and sudden turnaround, the idea, which would have been an anathema just a few years ago, that governments can further the public good while runaway economies without supervision can wreak havoc on social welfare. May now become the norm. On the dial that measures the continuum between the government and markets, the needle has decisively moved towards the left. For the first time since Margaret Thatcher captured the zeitgeist of an era when declaring that there is no such thing as society. Governments have the upper hand. Everything that comes in the post-pandemic era will lead us to rethink government's role. Rather than simply fixing market failures when they arise, they should, as suggested by the economist Mariana Mazzucato, move towards actively shaping and creating markets that deliver sustainable and inclusive growth. They should also ensure that partnerships with business involving government funds are driven by public interest, not profit. Source number 68. Middle of page 92. Don't care if there's a coffee ring on you. Don't care if there's a coffee ring on you, sir. Sir. Brought to you by America, America on the down. Oh, so you can use paradise. So rally me out when the twilight's last. I need to know the words. And our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner wave? Oh, the land of the free, in the home of the brave. Play ball! Space Force. Gotta watch that show. It's not just a show. There's two ways to think about Space Force. One, the show I haven't watched. Two, you can't handle the truth! Didn't work out. Just didn't work out. Sometimes it doesn't work. Ow. Wow. Time to get you here, man. My name's not My name's not I found a retail name thing that said Michael. I was like, my name's not Michael. My name's not Michael. Trying to date the daughter. You want me? You want it? Bad boy. What you gonna do? What you gonna do? Get her to spot and laptop. Alright, guys. Get back to page 90. Somewhere. Oh, yeah. Source number 68. Page 92. Source number 68. They should also ensure that partnerships with business involving government funds are driven by public interest, not profit. Source number 68. How will this expanded role of governments manifest itself? A significant element of new, bigger government is already in place. With the vastly increased and quasi-meditative government control of the economy, as detailed in Chapter 1. Public economic intervention has happened very quickly and on an unprecedented scale. In April 2020, just as the pandemic began to engulf the world, governments across the globe had announced stimulus programs amounting to several $1 trillion. As if 8 or 9. In April 2020, just as the pandemic began to engulf the world, governments across the globe had announced stimulus programs amounting to several $1 trillion. As if 8 or 9 Marshall Plans had been put into place almost simultaneously to support the basic needs of the poorest people, preserve jobs wherever possible, and help businesses to survive. Central banks decided to cut rates and committed to provide all the liquidity that was needed, while governments started to expand social welfare benefits. Make direct cash transfers, cover wages, and suspend loan and mortgage payments, among other responses. Only governments had the power, capability, and reach to make such decisions, without which economic calamity and a complete social meltdown would have prevailed. Looking to the future, governments will most likely, but with different degrees of intensity, decide that it's in the best interest of society to rewrite some of the rules of the game and permanently increase their role, as happened in the 1930s in the US, when massive unemployment and economic insecurity were progressively addressed by a larger role for government. Today, a similar course of action is likely to characterize the foreseeable future. We review in other subchapters the form this will take, like in the next one on the new social contract. But let's briefly identify some of the most salient points. Health and unemployment insurance. Health and unemployment insurance will either need to be created from scratch or be strengthened where it already exists. Social safety nets will need to be strengthened as well. In the Anglo-Saxon societies that are the most market-oriented, extended unemployment benefits, sick leave, and many other social measures will have to be implemented to cushion the effect of the shock, and will therefore become the norm. In many countries, renewed trade union engagement. Blew out this thing. Dumbass. Health and unemployment insurance. That's an issue. Health and health. Page 93. Trying to get to that bottom. 93. COVID, the Great Reset by Klaus Schwab and Theory right? For publishing digital holds and owns no copyright. This is for educational purposes. For the Socratic debate. Comments are encouraged. Now for page 93. Get it done. Get it done. Health and unemployment insurance will either be can you push the play button? Oh my god, we'll record. This thing's broken. Oh my god, stop it. Let's go. Stop it. I want my own airwave. My own magnet waves. Magnetic waves. I want my own brain. I want my own brain. Stop it. Stop using my brain. Alright. What do you mean? Look at now they confirmed or to die that I'm real. Or that you are even. Or that your ears work. Brain's on fire or something. Hello? 93? Yes, thank you for that. Health and unemployment. Oh my god. Take a break 93. This is a serious reading, so I'm not going to waste your time. Just give you a quick tip. Oh my god. Health and unemployment insurance will either need to be created from scratch or strengthened where it already exists. Social safety nets will need to be strengthened as well. Social safety nets will need to be strengthened as well. In the Anglo Saxon societies that are most market oriented, extended unemployment benefits, sick leave, and many other social measures will have to be implemented to cushion the effect of the shock and will therefore become the norm. In many countries, renewed trade union engagement will facilitate this process. Shareholder value will become a secondary consideration, bringing to the fore the primacy of stakeholder capitalism, the financialization of the world that gained so much traction in past years will probably go into reverse. Governments, particularly in the countries most affected by it, the US and the UK, will be forced to reconsider many features of this obsession with finance. They could decide on a broad range of measures, from making share buybacks illegal to preventing banks from incentivizing consumer debt. The public scrutiny of private companies will increase, particularly but not only for all the businesses that benefited from public money. Some countries will nationalize while others will prefer to take equity stakes or to provide loans. In general, there will be more regulation covering many different issues, such as workers' safety or domestic sourcing for certain goods. Businesses will also be held to account on social and environmental fractures, for which they will be expected to be part of the solution. As an add-on, governments will strongly encourage public-private partnerships so that private companies can get more involved in the mitigation of global risks. Irres- irrespective of the irrespective of the details, the role of the state will increase, and in doing so, will materially affect the way business is conducted. To varying degrees, business executives in all industries and all countries will have to adapt to greater government interventions, research and development for global public goods, such as health and climate change solutions will be actively pursued. Taxation will increase, particularly for the most privileged, because governments will need to strengthen their resilience capabilities and wish to invest more heavily in them, as advocated by Joseph Stiglitz. The first priority is to provide more funding for the public sector, especially for those parts of page 95. Especially for those parts. The first priority is to provide more funding for the public sector, especially for those parts of it that are designed to protect against the multitude of risks that a complex society faces, and to fund the advances in science and higher quality education on which our future prosperity depends. These are areas in which productive jobs, researchers, teachers, and those who help run the institutions that support them can be created quickly. Even as we emerge from the crisis, we should be aware that some other crisis study lurks around the corner. We can't predict what the next one will look like. Other than that, it will look different from the last. Source number 69. I thought I already smiled at that. Nowhere will this intrusion of governments, whose form may be benign or malign, depending on the country and the culture in which it is taking place, manifest itself with greater vigor. Vigor with greater manifest itself with greater vigor than in the redefinition of the social contract. 1.3.4. The social contract. It is most inevitable that the pandemic will prompt many societies around the world to reconsider and redefine terms of their social contract. We have already alluded to the fact that COVID-19 has acted as an amplifier of pre-existing conditions, bringing to force long-standing issues that resulted from deep structural frailties that had never been properly addressed. This dissonance and an emergent questioning of the status quo is finding expression in a loudening call to revise the social contracts by which we are all more or less bound. Page 6. Broadly defined, the social contract refers to the often implicit set of arrangements and expectations that govern the relations between individuals and institutions. Put simply, it is the glue that binds societies together. Without it, the social fabric unravels. For decades, it has slowly and almost imperceptibly evolved in a direction that forced individuals to assume greater responsibility for their individual lives and economic outcomes, leading large parts of the population, most evidently in the low income brackets, to conclude that the social contract was at best being eroded. If not, in some cases, breaking down entirely. The apparent inclusion of low or no inflation is a practical and illustrative example of how this erosion plays out in real life terms. For many years, the world over, the rate of inflation has fallen for many goods and services, with the exception of the three things that matter the most to a great majority of us: housing, healthcare, and education. For all three, prices have risen sharply, absorbing an ever proportion of disposable income. And in some countries, even forcing families to go into debt to receive medical treatment. Similarly, in the pre-pandemic era, yeah, fuck the motherfucker, you think you slick? Name the movie, New Enterprise. F the motherfucker, you think you slick? Can I buy a gun? Most people buy a gun. PCR tape or something. Name the movie, you win the prize. Name the movie, you win the prize. Lies in your eyes. Oh my God. Deep space. Bruce. What would Bruce Lee do? Pee water, my friend. Yeah, right. It's only because he kicked everybody's asses and he was tired already. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding, Bruce. I'm just kidding, Alaska. Don't you do it. Flow. I don't know what I'm talking about. Alright, let's get back to it. You Americans know nothing about fire. That crap again really happens. Or can I? Don't give up. Australians would not like these headphones. Space Force. Space Cowboy. Alright. This is freaking work. I don't know. What the hell is this? Alright. What a weirdo. How are you doing? Reading? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was reading. Justin Judaism, something like that. This is weird. Some bottles of coffee in the mall. We were reading 1.3.4. The social contract, pages 95, 96, 97. Can't do it. Page 97. What form might the new social contract take? There are no off-the-shelf, ready-to-go models because each potential solution depends upon the history and culture of the country to which it applies. Inevitably and understandably, a good social contract for China will be different from one another for the US, which in turn will not resemble that of Sweden or Nigeria. However, they could all share common features and principles, the absolute necessity of which has been made 98 ever more obvious by the social and economic consequences of the pandemic crisis. Two in particular stand out. One, a broader, if not universal, provision of social assistance, social insurance, healthcare, and basic quality services. Two, a move towards enhanced protection for workers and for those currently most vulnerable, like those employed in fueling a gig economy in which full-time employees are replaced by independent contractors and freelancers. It is often said that a nation's response to a disaster speaks volumes about its strengths and dysfunctions. And first and foremost, about the quality and robustness of its social contract as we progressively move away from the most acute moments of the crisis and begin a thorough examination of what went right and what didn't. We should expect a lot of soul searching that will ultimately lead to a redefinition of the terms of our social contract. In countries that were perceived as providing a subpar response to the pandemic, many citizens will start asking critical questions such as, why is it that in the midst of the pandemic, my country often lacked masks, respirators, and ventilators? Why wasn't it properly prepared? Does it have to do with the obsession with short-termism? Why are we so rich in GDP terms and so ineffective at delivering good health care to all those who need it? How can it be that a person who has spent more than 10 years training to become a medical doctor and whose end of year results are measured in lives receives compensation that is meager compared to that of a trader or a hedge fund manager? The COVID-19 crisis has laid bare the inadequate state of most national health systems, both in terms of cost of lives of patients and of nurses and doctors in rich countries where tax-funded health services have suffered for a long time from a lack of resources. The UK National Health Service being the most extreme example. The UK National Health Service being the most extreme example. Due to political concerns about rising taxes, calls for more spending and therefore higher taxes will get louder, with a growing realization that efficient management cannot compensate for underinvestment. COVID-19 has also revealed yawning gaps in the most welfare systems. At first glance, the nations that reacted in the most inclusive manner are those with an elaborate welfare system, most notably the Scandinavian countries. To provide an example, as early as March 2020, Norway guaranteed 80% of self-employment workers' average homes based on the tax returns of the previous 3 years, while Denmark guaranteed 75%. At the other end of the spectrum, the most market-oriented economies played catch-up and showed indecisiveness in how to protect the most vulnerable segments of the labor market, particularly the gig workers, the independent contractors, and on-call and temporary workers whose employment consists of income-earning activities that are outside the traditional employer-employee relationship. An important topic that may have a decisive impact on the new social contract is sick leave. Economists tend to agree that the absence of paid sick leave makes it harder to contain the spread, page 100, of an epidemic. The simple reason being that if employees are denied access to it, they may be tempted or forced to go to work while they are infected and thus spread the disease. This is particularly true for low-income and service workers. The two often go hand in hand. When the swine flu H1N1 pandemic occurred in 2009 to 2010, the American Public Health Association estimated that around 7 million people were infected, and an additional 1,500 died because contagious employees could not afford not to go to work. Among the rich economies, only the U.S. has a system that leaves it at the discretion of employers to decide whether to provide paid sick leave. In 2019, almost a quarter of all U.S. workers, about 40 million, largely concentrated in low-wage positions, did not benefit from it. In March 2020, when the pandemic started to rage in the U.S., President Trump signed into law new legislation that temporarily required employers to provide 2 weeks of sick leave plus family leave at partial pay, but only for workers with childcare problems. It remains to be seen how this will feature in the redefinition of the social contract in the U.S. By contrast, almost all European countries require employers to provide paid sick leave for varying periods, during which workers are also protected from dismissal. New laws that were promulgated at the beginning of the pandemic also meant that the state could compensate part or the whole salary of people confined at home, including those working in the gig economy and freelancers. In Japan, all workers are entitled to up to 20 days of paid leave every year, while in China, they are entitled to sick pay that ranges from 60% to 100% of daily wages during any period of illness. The length of sick leave, contractually agreed or defined between workers and employers. As we move forward, we should expect such issues to intrude more and more. In the redefinition of our social contract, another aspect that is critical for social contracts in Western democracies pertains to liberties and freedom. There is currently growing concern that the fight against this pandemic and future ones will lead to its creation of permanent surveillance societies. This issue is explored in more detail in the chapter on the technological reset, but suffice to say that a state emergency can only be justified when a threat is public, universal, and existential. In addition, political terrorists often emphasize that extraordinary powers require authorization from the people and must be limited in time and proportion. One can agree with the former part of the assertion, public, universal, and existential threat. But what about the latter? Except it is to be a prominent component of future discussions about what our social contract should look like. Collectively redefining the terms of our social contracts is an epochal task that binds the substantial challenges of the present moment to the hopes of the future. As handling the future, failure could set the world on fire. Source number 72. While reflecting on the contours we think a future social contract might follow, we ignore at our peril the opinion. We ignore at our peril the opinion of the younger generation who will be asked to live with it. Their adherence is decisive. And thus, to better understand what they want, we must not forget to listen. This made all the more significant by the fact that the younger generation is likely to be more radical than the older one in refashioning our social contract. The pandemic has upended their lives, and a whole generation across the globe will be defined by economic and often social insecurity, with millions due to enter the workforce in the midst of a profound recession. They will bear these scars forever, also starting off with a deficit. Many students have educational debts, is likely to have long-term effects. Already, millennials, at least in the Western world, are worse off than their parents in terms of earnings, assets, and wealth. They are less likely to own a home or have children than their parents were. Now, another generation, Gen Z, is entering a system it sees as failing and that will be beset by long-standing problems revealed and exacerbated by the pandemic. As a college junior quoted in the New York Times put it, young people have a deep desire for radical change because we see the broken path ahead. Source number 73. How will this generation respond? By proposing radical solutions and often radical action in an attempt to prevent the next disaster from striking. Whether it's climate change or social inequalities, it will most likely demand a radical alternative to the present course, because its members are frustrated and dogged by a nagging belief that the current system is fractured beyond repair. Youth activism is increasing worldwide, source number 74, being revolutionized by social media that increases mobilization to an extent that would have been impossible before, source number 75. It takes many different forms, ranging from non-institutionalized political participation to demonstrations and protests, and addresses issues as diverse as climate change, economic forums, gender equality, and LGBT rights. The young generation is firmly at the vanguard of social change. There is little doubt that it will be the catalyst for change and a source of critical momentum for the Great Reset to be continued. 1.4. Geopolitical reset is up next somewhere, hopefully not. Now, page 103. COVID-19, the Great Reset, written by Klaus Schwab, a theory now LRA, published by Foreign Publishing. This Schwab copyrights is doing this for educational purposes. Page 103 should have been free. What's 103 in the gematria? So we got Hello, Odin. See, I'm God. I don't know what this is. Lambo, Nickelback, Band Meal, Name Bald. Oh hell, Bald Mane. I have bald and a mane. Weird. I have no idea what that stuff is. It sounds like it said bald and mane, and I have bald and a mane.